Welcome to another conversation in People in Fundraising. This podcast features interviews with nonprofit professionals who discuss their career journeys, lessons learned, and enthusiasm for working in fundraising. And here's your host, the founder of People in Fundraising, Tim Wilson.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode in Season 3 of the People in Fundraising Professional Conversations webcast. And today, I am really excited to welcome Jennifer Harris and Jason Lewis to People in Fundraising. Hello to you both.
Hi.
Hi, glad to be here.
I'm excited to have you both here. Jennifer, in a moment, is going to tell us who she is in the nonprofit landscape, and Jason as well. Excited to have both of you on. You're representing kind of the both coasts of the country today as well. And it's November 6th, 2023. So Jennifer, if you can go first, just tell our audience a little bit about you first, please.
Sure. Okay. So I am founder and president of JH Collective. I've been working at the intersection of fundraising, communications, and strategy for about 12 years on my own, and a little over 20 years, collectively. And I work with clients in the higher ed, academic medicine, association, and justice spaces. So kind of expansive.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Tim. My name's Jason Lewis. I'm the founder of Responsive Fundraising. We're a consultancy actually based in Chicago with my business partner. I am in York, Pennsylvania. We've lived here for 15 years. And we sort of see ourselves as consultancy that's focused on, long-term and strategic rather than short-term and tactical. I've been in fundraising. I think I've been, I'm over that 2 decades sort of thing, but I don't think I'm quite at the 25. I don't think I can own 25 years yet. But this has been my professional career, and not certainly like a lot of us. It's not the one that I expected to, it's not what I sort of just fell in my lap like a lot of us. So, but that's who I am, and delighted to be here today.
Wonderful. Thank you both. And before we get into our first question, I just want to give the audience a little bit of heads up. I have been connected to Jennifer and Jason on LinkedIn for about 18 months or so. And as I was building out my guest list, both Jennifer and Jason are very active on the platform. And I really enjoy the thought-provoking posts, the insights about what they see working well in nonprofits and social impact, and areas that let's put our minds together and see what we can do to change some practices. And so that was eye-opening for me in a good way, refreshing way. And I thought, man, if I could ever get them on the program, it'd be great. So I reached out to Jennifer, and then Jennifer invited Jason. And so here we are today. So thank you. And if we could then, from your introductions, just talk about what motivated you both to start first JH Collective and then Jason with Responsive Fundraising, please.
Yeah, so I sort of unintentionally started a company 12 years ago as a response to some of the challenges that we continue to see in academic and higher ed fundraising. So I left a job that had significant turnover, all the trends that we're probably going to go into greater detail around, that Jason and I both speak into: toxicity, turnover, mismarked metrics, cultural issues, all of that stuff. I left a job in the fall of 2011 without an intention of starting my own company. My intention was to heal my heart and really work on re-relating to the work, because I was one of those younger professionals who was moved by missions and once I got into the mission and realized that it's not just about the mission, there's all these other bags of tricks that come with working in our space that aren't all rose-colored glasses. So I knew I needed to do some healing work. I needed to re-relate to my career path or be able to pursue it. And so I started writing, which is how I started writing Awakening Authentic Ask, in maybe a few years after I left my job. But I also just started to get work. And one of my first contracts was with a consultancy not far from Jason. We didn't know each other at the time. And they flew out to a university to do some discovery work. And at that point in time, I had also already worked with a lot of the major firms that existed in our space. My academic medical center that I worked for hired the big names, which we can remain nameless. So I had an inside sort of view into what being on both sides of the spectrum was, hiring a firm and being part of one. And I came back to California just through word of mouth. I was asked to come in and step into a consultancy type of role with a nonprofit locally. And I realized I think I can do this. But I didn't even have a website until year 3. I didn't incorporate until then. I still was just every day going, I think I can do this. I think I can do this. And then all of a sudden I was in it and I'm like, oh, I'm doing this. And now it's been 12 years and it's a continuous experiment, which Jason and I, he'll probably talk about too. We talk about that together, about this sort of continuous reinvention of self while you're learning and building a business and building your brand and building the way in which you work and the tools that you use. So that's sort of how I always say in short that it was both a healing exercise and a creative pursuit. And also, luck and connection and being in the right space at the right time.
Absolutely.
I'm sure, Jason, you can relate.
Yeah, Tim. So my consulting journey has sort of been in sort of 2 parts. So first and foremost, after I left my last employer, I was with an organization here where we live for about 6 years, and the choice to start consulting rather than seek out another job was just a practical one, a commitment on my wife and I's part to stay rooted in this particular community, and for me to find opportunities outside of the area rather than move our family again. And so that was the initial when I started my consulting journey 10 years ago. That was sort of that initial, and I was in the private independent school space at the time, and so I partnered up with a business partner in Austin and worked with Chuck for a couple of years, and really got my head wrapped around sort of what was working and what wasn't working, in terms of how the consulting world helps and assists and makes sense of the fundraising challenges that nonprofit organizations encounter. And then Tim, in 2018, I published my first book. I published a book that was actually written to the small, primarily parachurch organizations that I had historically worked with. Even in the subtitle, I referenced the idea of small shops, but that particular book did surprisingly well.
Awesome.
Helped me establish a platform that I was not anticipating. I genuinely thought I was just writing a book that was just intended for largely the organizations, the small parachurch, faith-based organizations that I had been working with for 5 or 6 years and had been employed with prior to that. But when you've got, D1s, fundraisers at D1 schools and at big healthcare organizations giving you feedback and affirming some of the things that I was saying, and some big voices also saying that, in many ways I was putting into a little book words that they had hot thought themselves, but they needed somebody to put it on paper. And so I took that as an indication that perhaps I ought to bet on this. And so just before the pandemic, I started working on a business plan to, I very graciously parted ways with my business partner who was in the private school space and started working on Responsive. And Tim, and I sort of mentioned this in my introductory remarks, but I come to, our consulting team comes to work with clients. One of the first things we talk about is differentiating their thinking between the short term and the long term and the strategic and the tactical. And I think a lot of the consultancies out there, and perhaps just simply because this is what the client demands, they're very focused on very short term, tactical, channel specific sort of solutions. And somebody has to be, some consultancy, some voices have to get in there and say, okay, we've got to think about this a little more strategic and a little bit more long term, so that you're not constantly feeling like you're, the house is on fire or something.
Sure.
And so we've developed tools that are largely oriented almost like we've almost got like a curriculum that we teach that's intended to help the organization finally choose. A lot of organizations do not, from their earliest founding, they don't make a decision to be very intentional about fundraising. They're intentional about everything else, but they don't necessarily always think very intentionally about fundraising. And so we come in and try to challenge them to do that. And if they're 5 years, 10 years in, it's probably easier than if they're decades in.
Sure.
Because they've learned in many cases a lot of bad habits. So, yeah, that's what we do, and we're gonna keep doing it.
That's excellent. Thank you both. I would love to hear how Jennifer and Jason, you got connected to each other, please.
Well, interestingly enough, hearing Jason talk about his business, I can almost reflect back like the moments of synergistic thinking. I talk with my clients quite a bit about mindset and methods. Like those are the two kind of frames that I look at. And Jason similarly looks at beliefs in relation to the way in which we work. Jason, correct me if I'm wrong, but belief, he calls it belief work. I call it mindset work, very synergistic. And strategy. And, we were talking about this earlier where I'm not sure if I started following him first or he started following me. I started to think, Jason, that it might have been when I was asked to be the presenter at LVI at Lehigh Valley. Because you were that the year after. So
yeah.
And this kind of covers a couple of your questions. So I wrote Awakening the Authentic Ask in 2016, and it garnered a lot of attention. And that was really like a love letter to myself and to the profession. Awesome. And as a result, I was asked to develop a workshop at Lehigh Valley Philanthropic Institute, or Philanthropy Institute. And it was really interesting because they told me, come out. You might get like 20 to 30 people in the room. You're going to do an Authentic Ask workshop. And, I was prepared per usual. This was 2018. And there was like 85 people in the room.
Wow.
And I remember feeling like, wow, this is the first time I'm using this kind of language about our field publicly. And then I think short after, Jason, was how maybe Jeanette connected us. I'm not sure.
Maybe,
but
yeah.
Nevertheless, right? Like, I feel like that might have been the thing. So I started following his work. He sent me like 10 books. I, of course, wanted to talk to him about it. And then, God, I think his books has, what is it? The War in Fundraising. And I was like, I don't know how I feel about combat language. I used a lot of I was like, I don't know about this combat language stuff. And then it just kind of started this tempestuous yet endearing friendship where we challenge each other and we'll check in. If I feel like I'm posting something that's a little bit bold or controversial, sometimes I'll get his gut check before and vice versa.
Yeah.
He sends me text messages of chapters of his book, and I'm like, I can't read this on my phone. You're ruminating. I can see it. The audience can't see it, but I see you thinking.
Yeah, I think there's a so it's I'm Jennifer, I'm reflecting on our mutual friendship with the folks in the Lehigh Valley, and trying to sort of add some additional layer to what I think your firm, what's similar between the way that you operate your firm and the way that we're trying to build Responsive. And Tim, I think what is happening is if you think about sort of the three of us, so we're both a couple decades into our career, and we sort of have this preceding generation of experts that that we're given the opportunity to sort of be experts in in what I oftentimes refer to as a messy adolescence. Fundraising for the last couple of decades has certainly been navigating what I call its messy adolescence. But I think where we find fundraising now, and I think what the opportunity is for firms like Jennifer's and mine, is that we're actually, fundraising is growing up. It's becoming a much more mature field, and at times Jennifer and I would probably agree that we don't feel like it feels very mature, but it is maturing. So it's going through those growing pains. And consequently, both the challenge and the opportunity for the quote unquote expert in the room is very different than I would say that those who came before us necessarily have. I feel like when I'm in the room with my colleagues, that I have more of a, sure, I'm knowledgeable and I can certainly wear the posture and the role of being an expert, but I'm in many ways a peer. And my professional sort of story in many ways coincides with many of the people that I'm providing services to, for providing counsel to. And so, and I think the times have changed too. A lot of, and Jennifer knows this, a lot of what I have spent a lot of my time familiarizing myself with over the last 24 months or so is just sort of the evolution of our expertise. And for the most part, we sort of rode sidecar, if you will, with sales and marketing and the marketplace in general for most of the 20th century. And I think in some ways our professional community now is sort of waking up to the idea that perhaps we need to be a professional domain of our own. And while there's parts and pieces of what we do that are very consistent with what happens in the marketplace, there may be other aspects of what we do that are unique and need to be distinguished and separate. And I think the more we make sense of that, the more we're going to be able, and that's all part of that moving from a messy adolescence and navigating growing pains as a professional community. And so I do think that the challenge and the opportunities for individuals like Jennifer and I, as we sort of navigate our aspirations to be, experts in the field, are different than those who, perhaps came before us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Jennifer, anything you'd like to add or respond to that?
I mean, I think he captured it quite well. I think one of the things, Jason, you said, I guess I'd add, is we both are constantly interrogating what expertise actually is, too. So not just like, are we experts, right? Like, but what it actually is and what it means. And also, a question I always ask Jason from the beginning, ask a lot of my peers is fundraising a thing itself? Like, is it a thing, or is it something that always needs to be integrated in? Whether you're at a university, an academic medical center, a small nonprofit, fundraising is often sequestered or siloed from like the sort of centripetal force of the institution or the organization. And so when I talk about inside out work from a fundraising perspective, it's inside the body and out, but inside the body of the org out too. So like not just the self, like it's almost like the spine, right? Or connective tissue in an organization. There's not a single function that fundraising doesn't touch. And I love your face right now. I wish people could see you smiling. But Jason and I, so we'll debate this, right? And it's like always healthy debate, because like, have we gotten the story wrong?
Yeah.
Like at the end of the day, where he and I really do come together is, have we gotten the story of this work wrong? Like have we even lost sight, right? Like, have we lost sight of the origin story, or was there never an origin story to begin with? Because maybe it wasn't the thing itself, right? It was just this thing we added on. So in order for us to become something mature, to use Jason's words, or to grow out of adolescence into adulthood, we actually have to become more than a thing. Like actually have to become a body of thinking, a body of feeling, a body of experiencing, and frankly, like a leader body, which is a huge vacuum in this profession. Jason, wouldn't you agree? Yeah.
Yeah.
I love those visual analogies, the adolescence and growing up, and then Jennifer, the spine and the connective tissue. Those both, my mind gravitates towards those types of visual cues and analogies. So that fascinating way to talk about it.
Yeah, and if you think about it, Jennifer has a very rich background in healthcare, and she's talking about she's talking about a living system. She's talking about a body, and I don't think when we borrow too much of our thinking, from early 20th century, marketing, we're borrowing a very mechanical way of seeing and understanding the world. And so when Jennifer's talking about the messy complexity that exists inside of our body, and as it is a living system, we also have to acknowledge that we are by no means the only professional circle of people that are not wrestling with the same thing. We all navigated the way that we all saw and understood the world throughout the 20th century. We all have been affected by industrialization, all of those sorts of things, whether we're, all of our respective sort of subdomains, if you will, within the nonprofit sector have been affected by the way that we made sense of things, and consequently fundraising just sort of, carried along. And we're navigating, maturity, and it's messy and uncomfortable, and it stretches us sometimes.
Yeah.
Well, what you're saying, Jason, is by nature, efficiency cultures are disembodied. So to be efficient, you need to dehumanize a system, right? Like, and to be efficient, we need to be disembodied, because if we feel too much, then we can't work like machines, right? Jason and I are always talking about, like, how do we get I use the body language, but like get the body back in this work, get the heart back in this work, get what is instinctive and primal about philanthropic work back to the center of the story, instead of the sort of dysregulated body, which is about efficiencies, accrue more donors, more mailings, more events, more staff. Even sometimes I'm like, hold on, we don't need more staff, let's slow down, let's see if we're even using the talent that we have well, right? So I love I know we're derailing you a bit, Tim, but I love that Jason knows the 20th century history so well, because like for me, it validates a lot of the human work that I'm paying attention to. Like, oh, this is how, when I would say fundraising has become far too mechanized, like, why is it so systematized? Why is it so robotic? Where is there room for feeling? Where is there room for connecting? Where is there room for heart? that's not being discussed often at our leading conferences or our leading,
No.
in our leading consultancies. And so we would talk like that. And he would be like, well, let me tell you about the industrial age. And I was like, yes, you have the research.
Yes.
So, yeah, good.
Good stuff. I wanted to pick up, my next question is specifically for Jennifer. You mentioned the heart of the story and what's the origin, which I think is a beautiful segue to how I first felt I needed to have you on the program, because you made a post on LinkedIn that referenced Carl Sagan, like one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century, talking about the quote from him, quote, "We are all just stardust." And I grew up watching the original Cosmos, and it's just fascinating. So when I saw that post, I'm like, I got to have you on. That's I'm to talk about this, the origin story and the heart of the story. My question for you is, what motivates you to pour your heart into that platform, please?
Yeah, so I was trying to think about that, and I'm certainly not as methodical or religious about it as some content producers, including Jason has a pretty good discipline. For me, often I'm writing from an expressive writing space. So what that means is I'm trying to re-relate to the work constantly through my posts. So sometimes a Chronicle of Philanthropy article will trigger a feeling, and then I'll text Jason and say, am I fair? Is this fair enough for me to write about? Sometimes I trigger finger. But other times I'll be really thinking about something for quite a bit of time, and I need to process it. So I don't have, for example, a book. I have a manuscript over here that's like years of writing, but I haven't put it out as a book. And I think in large part because I've been trying to exercise this expressive writing muscle, which for me is a path to healing. It's a path to understanding. It's a path to connecting. It's a path to really, kind of getting a pulse on the larger, I guess I would say community feelings, if you will. So I'm not, whenever people ask a question like that, like, what's your social media strategy? I don't subscribe to the must post every Thursday at 8 a.m. or must post. And Jason and I tried, remember we talked about this years ago. I'm like, that doesn't work for me, because more often than not, when I respond to a feeling in the world, that's when I get more traction. When I'm really listening to what is going on in the world, instead of I've got to write about a gala this Thursday, or next Friday I'm going to talk about metrics, and next Friday, that's not how it really works for me. I know it does for others. And also, just to be totally honest, I have a group of writers that work with Informies in my collective, but I'm in general a one-woman show. And so I have a lot of client work that takes precedence always.
Sure.
However, I'll add that what I write gets reflected back in my work. And anyone who I'm working with, including a university right now, they'll see those posts and they'll say, oh, you were just talking about that in our meeting. And because I could feel where there was traction from the group, and I said, oh, okay, I want to share this with the audience. So it's not as strategic, but it's actually very much so emergent. And I hope that answers.
Totally. That's great. Thank you so much. And I just love to hear, in your own words, because following along is you can come up with ideas of why someone is so active, but to get it right from you is awesome. So thank you. And Jason, for you, so in addition to founding Responsive Fundraising, you teach nonprofit management and social enterprise at York College of Pennsylvania. My question for you is, in addition to this, I imagine the skills that you're hoping to hone and develop in these students, what else are you hoping to convey about nonprofit work in your curriculum and in your interactions with the students?
Yeah, it's interesting, Tim, that you, I was was very excited that you put that in your outline of questions, because I haven't been given the opportunity yet to articulate this. So this is kind of, I appreciate this. So in 2019, I was asked, the local college where my kids are going to school, and we've been affiliated loosely over the years, asked me to start teaching their nonprofit management course. And then they subsequently asked me to pick up the social entrepreneurship course. And then there's a couple of other courses that I've picked up. I now teach their small business consulting class. And what's been quite seems providential is that all of the classes that I'm teaching, this mix of about 5 or 6 classes that I teach between the spring and the fall semesters, all are almost line up perfectly with the type of work that I do and the commitments that I've made professionally in my career. And I think this is sort of getting at the question that you're asking, because this is certainly the way that I like to come at my consulting work. What I find to be very refreshing in the classroom is just that eager enthusiasm and that look on the face of a student who genuinely wants to learn something new, and who trust me to be knowledgeable in a particular area. There's certainly a myriad of all sorts of classes going on that particular campus that I am by no means qualified to teach, but with this small set of classes that I've been asked to teach, I do consider myself qualified to teach them. And it is refreshing to be in the classroom and to translate what is unfamiliar. And for most of my students, it's the nonprofit sector and social entrepreneurship are relatively unfamiliar and uncharted territory for most students. I teach registration just opened up for the spring last week, and I've got I'm teaching 2 sections of our nonprofit management course. That's the class I've been teaching now for 5 years. And I have to say, it's a class that I've enjoyed. I walk the students, Tim. I start the class with what we call a purpose essay, and I want the students to differentiate between what is passion and purpose. And so I have them write this short essay that distinguishes between what their passions are versus purpose. And once they have found their purpose, we try to we align that with an organization that they're interested in doing some field research with. So if a student, for example, if hunger happens to be hunger or homelessness happens to be, for example, a concern of theirs, then we try to align their field research project with an organization that aligns with their purpose essay. And these students tend to be juniors and seniors. So they're at the back end of their career. They're at the back end of their college career and thinking about career decisions. And it's encouraging to take their purpose, familiarize myself with it, help them perhaps open up their window of opportunities, if you will, to what they might be able to do, to perhaps see their course of study also align with the nonprofit sector that they otherwise didn't see. I don't speak in that particular class, or even in most of my classes, on fundraising a whole lot. None of the classes at this point are centered on fundraising. But it is encouraging to teach in that space, because there just seems to be at times so much that we're, complaining about in our sector. And these students tend to see the world a little more optimistically. I guess that's what you do at 21, 19, 20, 21 years old when you're, and so it's a little refreshing and encouraging. So,
yeah.
I hope that answers. I don't know if that answers your question, but it did allow me to talk a little bit about the experience.
I just want to add to Jason what you didn't say. Of course, I'm like sisterly squeezing myself in. So one of the things that Jason and I also talk about that's a gap in our profession is a learning community. So we talk often about how conferences have not really been they've been educational, right, in some ways, but in terms of really building a learning community of people of all levels who have the courage and conviction to ask really big and bold questions, like we haven't seen that. And so what binds Jason and I and a few others in our sort of inner circle is this willingness to really ask hard questions and ask big questions. We talk often that we don't have as much to lose because we're self-employed, right? Like we have our own businesses. So we're willing to be the mouthpieces for others. But the reason why I wanted to poke my nose in and say that is because I know how much he enjoys teaching at the university. I facilitate often and run a lot of workshops, and I think the like connectivity there is that we both really desire being in spaces where you can like be bold, ask about big ideas, like interrogate them, test them, challenge them, right, Jason? Is that
I think you're right. You and I do talk a lot about being professional learning communities. We need to learn how to do that. And I have paid a lot of attention over the years to the way that professional communities, if we're talking about medicine, if we're talking about law, we're talking about any sort of professional community, there oftentimes is a deep and abiding commitment to learning and asking science. I mean, science doesn't work absent, the idea that you're constantly asking questions. I mean, what purposes do we have if we're not constantly sort of interrogating our own sort of conclusions and the hypotheses that we come up with? That's what these professional communities do. And I think ours is, and I think this kind of takes us back to my comments about being in our messy adolescence. When you're a teenager, you don't like asking questions. When I'm 13, I mean, I've got a house full of teenagers. I know what it's like to be, and I remember myself, what it's like to be 13, 14, 15 years old and having to wrestle with the fact that, there's something mom or dad told me that they might actually be right about. No way in hell that they're right about that sort of stuff. And I think that's where we're at, is that we need to be asking bigger and bolder questions. And I'm convinced, and Jennifer and I, we could name some names if we were asked to. I think there are people in our space right now that are willing to ask those questions. I think there's also others who won't.
Sure.
And are sort of guarding the Emerald City, as I call it, the status quo, and I think it's just because that's what's comfortable. But man, we could really, I could just ramble on.
Well, I did joke before we started recording that I was going to book you both for 3 to 4 hours, and unfortunately we're almost up at the hour mark. So I would love for the last 10 minutes or so to have you have talked both about learning communities and seeing the world and certain people that question why things are done in a certain way. And as I say that, I'm thinking of Senator Kennedy when he eulogized his brother Bobby. I think it's an Irish quote. Some men see the world as it is and they ask why, and others dream of things that never were and ask why not. I would love if you both could take a moment or 2 or 3. And you've mentioned big questions a couple of times. And I would just wondered, I'd love to give you a chance, if you're comfortable, to maybe share some of the big questions you're grappling with in our profession, please.
Ooh, that's a really powerful quote. I could write about for some time.
Yes. Yeah.
It's interesting, Tim, right before we jumped on, I pulled a quote from an exercise Jason and I did together. We did a writing prompt together about, what is the insanity in our field? And like, what is this, desperation that we feel, like, what are we seeking? And one of the big questions that I asked in that was, what do we do if we know the tools we're used to and the tools that we're used to employing are no longer good for us?
Wow.
So what do we do if the tools we're used to employing are no longer good for us? And so I wrote that because I think we're reaching an inflection point, to use a buzzword,
yeah,
where Jason and I no longer have to scream into this like void about what all the problems are. Like, I think we see it, right? Like a lot of us see the challenges. I rarely, and I know you had this as a question too, I rarely get pushback when I ask a big question. In fact, I often get a lot of private messages from folks who are like, I can't answer this publicly, but thank you, because, you know, my employer might see. But so the point that we're in, I think, is not about naming the problems as much as it is creating space for new solutions. So again, to go to your Kennedy quote, it's so similar, right? Like, so what do we do if the tools that we're employing are no longer good for us? And I've asked boards, right? If I give you every single tool that I have access to in my toolkit, every person in the world that I know, would you still feel comfortable going out into the world and asking for money? And the room is silent. There is an issue, right?
Yeah.
And in the same vein, if I ask a group of fundraisers, okay, if we're going to take away some of these tools that Jason calls arm's length tools, but some of these tools that we're used to depending on, you know, direct marketing, direct response, events, even some of the prospect research, right? Like, can we do this work? And it's quiet. We're obviously not going into that space where we can actually think about what's on the other side, what's never been done before.
Yeah.
And frankly, you know, and I'll end with, and let Jason chime in, you know, one of the key themes that I bring into all of my workshops now is creativity, because where are we creating space to actually create and innovate and reimagine or imagine a new set of tools for a new time?
Yeah.
So that's where I'm at. I don't have all the answers, but I will be alongside folks as we continue to ask really hard questions. And I will point out when a room gets silent and that there is a reason for that, right? Like, we can't just fill a void with extra noise because we aren't going to create space for something new. We have to create space for something new.
I love that. That was awesome, Jennifer. Thank you. How about you?
Tim, there's three. So I hosted the Fundraising Talent podcast for about 5 years, and I wrapped it up back in May. And we used a question-based sort of format. I invited my guests to come on and always ask a question. And after broadcasting, 350 plus episodes of that particular podcast, I sort of started to or somewhere in those later numbers, I started to ask myself, what are the questions that fundraisers are not asking? Because they were always invited. Tim, if you were a guest on the Fundraising Talent podcast, you would have been invited to come on there and have a big idea or bold opinion that we would have structured around a question. And we would have taken the conversation in that particular direction. And in many cases, I didn't know where you were going to go with it.
Cool.
But there were three what I've come to, and this I've sort of referenced some of this thinking, and none of this is going to be unfamiliar to Jennifer. But the three questions that I've sort of been centering my thinking around and a lot of my research and writing on in the last 24 months or so are these questions. Who is the donor? I feel like we've gotten the donor question wrong. I think at the beginning of the 20th century, we answered that question. Historians will tell us that we answered the question that the donor and the consumer are one and the same, and I don't think that's true. And so that's one of those questions that I don't think we're encouraged. It seems so fundamental, and it would seem like we would all know how to answer that question, but answer the question, who is the donor? And then you can take that same question and you continue it a little further and you say, what is it that we're exchanging? What is it? What is this transaction that's happening? And I think that we think that we're buying and selling commodities, and that's not actually what's happening. Right. We're exchanging gifts. And a lot of us don't actually spend a lot of time early in our career understanding what it means to exchange gifts. And then finally, and I'm sort of giving you the rough outline to this writing project that I've been working on for some time. What's the context in which that happens? So typically when we see ourselves as consumers and we're exchanging commodities, buying and selling commodities, we see ourselves as being part of a competitive marketplace. And you hear that language in a lot of our conversations. I'm sure you've had guests that will refer to our sector is almost a competitive marketplace, that we're just one industry amongst many.
Right.
And I don't think that's true. I think that we're in a completely different domain, and I think we need to wrestle with that. When we recognize that when we exchange gifts, we're not consumers, that the nature of the relationship is wrong, that maybe some of this borrowing language is not right, and so there's your questions.
Just to add, when we talk about how, one of the things we are hearing people return to is this idea that fundraising is relational work, but yet relational work and paired with all of this predictive modeling that we want to apply to relational work. If we're in partnership with someone, like, we are not going to be mind readers like that. Even if I, knew a whole lot of things about someone before I went on a date, when I show up on the date, like, he's going to be a whole lot different than I created in my mind, right?
Oh, sure.
And so in this fundraising world, we've done all this stuff, right, in quotes, like to predict an outcome that we certainly cannot predict. And if there's anything that the pandemic showed us, I think is that, right? Like that we can't, the predictive modeling, analytics, prospect research, it's all great tools, but until you are sitting with someone, whether it's a fundraiser, a donor, an administrative leader, a faculty member, you really don't know what their relationship to the work is. And I think we have to return to that a little bit. Like, we have to pause and stop trying to know before we know, right, Jason? He always talks about base coaching and talk about that quickly. And I know you have to wrap up.
Yeah, I just think we have to let the work be. I think we have to let the work be within an appropriate context, and I don't think we've what one group of researchers refer to as a wicked learning environment, and oftentimes a wicked learning environment is where we're not able to connect the dots between our experiences and sort of what's actually letting us down, and so what we think we're learning isn't necessarily the right sort of things. And most in a very complex world where you have things changing all the time and you have so much connectivity that we have all of sort of the myriad of things that we would sort of describe as wicked problems that exist in our world, we're all navigating wicked learning environments. And I don't think that fundraising is at that place yet where it wants to own up to the fact that it is a pretty damn wicked learning environment. And it's going to require us to sort of look at some of our underlying assumptions a little differently. Dorothy, anybody who knows, Dorothy's navigating of Oz is an example of what it means to sort of be navigating a wicked learning environment. That was a world that sort of wasn't governed by the same rules. And fundraising is like that too. We need to be okay with the idea that the exchange of gifts isn't necessarily governed by the same rules that the marketplace is. Gosh, you got me on my soapbox right there at the end, Jennifer. So,
but I think,
I almost thought I was going to get away with not talking about Dorothy, but I did reference Dorothy.
Sir, producer over here.
But I think, expanding on that Wizard of Oz story, they talk about the need for a heart and brain and courage and being true to yourself. And so I think those are all of the key ingredients that are not going to be baked into a predictive modeling resource.
But what's the brilliance of that, Tim? The brilliance of that is, and this is the nature of the type of work that Jennifer and I like to do, and is certainly the work that I like to do. I like to remind fundraisers the point of that is they had all those things. They had the head, the heart. They had all of those things. And I think we're, and this gets back to the earliest parts of the conversation about the idea of expertise. My job is not to come in and convince you that you're missing a bunch of things.
Yeah.
My job in many cases is to convince you that you got plenty of donors, you got all the technology you need, and you've got all the head and heart you need. You just got to take somebody out to lunch and convince yourself of that. Because Dorothy had everything that she needed. And I think there's a lot of fundraisers out there and a lot of executive directors who employ them that just need to be convinced that they've got a lot of things working in their favor. And in some cases, people like ourselves are too much crowding the conversation because we major on what's missing and where the deficits are.
Yeah,
Sorry.
to use a phrase that's been used a lot lately, we've kind of lost the plot in this work, right? Like, what is the story that we are walking inside of? What is that story? And I think that's what Jason and I often like zoom up and out and are like, what are we hearing? What's the narrative here? Like, what's the plot? What are the plot points? Who are the characters? We could go on and on.
Well, I mean, this has been such a bold and fun and invigorating conversation. And I just felt the need to liken it to maybe the classroom that Jason teaches in. Like, it's been almost like a semester's worth of curriculum. And like any good class, you walk away challenged, and you're thinking about, I heard something that in the class that, I have a different take on it, or I haven't thought about it that way. And you both have done a really good job giving us some examples of the big questions, the things that work, the things that desperately need to change, talking about, sanity and a thirst for meaning. So thank you both so much. This has been an awesome privilege for me.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, Tim, we privileged. It's been a privilege. We really enjoyed this.
Well, thank you so much. This has been great. I look forward to keeping in touch. And we got through almost all the questions, which is dynamite. You guys are spot on. So thank you. It's been really enjoyable. And I look forward to staying in contact with both of you through LinkedIn and hearing what else is going on in your worlds with how you're thinking about our profession.
Thank you, Tim.
And for our audience, you will be able to find Jason and Jennifer's conversation on my website, peopleinfundraising.com. It will air in early January of 24. It'll also go live on LinkedIn that day as well. So thank you for supporting this endeavor. And thank you to my terrific guests today, Jennifer Harris and Jason Lewis. It's been awesome.
Thanks, Tim.
Yeah.